Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Animals and Society Colloquium. My name is Carol Glasser. I'm a member of the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. We co-host this colloquium series along with the Animals and Society Institute. If you are a sociologist and you want to know more about the Animals and Society section of ASA, please come to me and let me know. And I'll send you that information. And hopefully everybody is following ASI because they speak to a broad group of academics, scholars, and practitioners in the human animal studies world. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Ken Shapiro, who's with ASI, to tell you a little bit about ASI, our colloquium, and then introduce our speaker, which we are all here for today.
Hello, folks. Thank you, Carol. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Animals and Society Institute, but just our primary projects have been helping to develop the field of human animal studies through journal publications and book series and support of early scholars and support of universities outside the United States that are beginning to form curriculum around the field and perhaps minors and majors and concentrations and the like. So that's us. I'm so happy to welcome Mayank. He's an assistant professor at Nirma University, Ahmedabad, India. His research interests include cultural studies, gender studies, and human animal studies. His ongoing research focuses on representations of animality in film and fiction. I'm so happy to have your presentation and thank you for your contributions to the important interface between human animal studies and literary studies. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. And uh, I'll just share my screen so that it becomes easy for everybody to see. And first of all, I would like to thank the Animal and Society Institute as well as Dr. Carol for allowing me to do this presentation. Just to begin now, it's while I was researching for my for human animal studies and human animal studies, I thought this was a very interesting topic to look into, especially for a context like India, where, as I would say, the consumption of animals is the lowest, one of the lowest in the world. The FAO stat gives gives it as 3.69 per capita. So just the topic, it is, I named the topic searching for inedibility in literary fiction and non-fiction of India. So just to give a very brief introduction, the idea of inedibility and the three topics that I would be discussing, the idea of inedibility, what domestication would be, and what is grief. So these three things and how they are interlinked as well. So these are the three main topics that I would be covering today. Firstly, the idea of inedibility. So what inedibility would imply? So this, while I was reading Judith Butler's work, she has this idea of grievability. So it is something I found could be translated here as well. So one of the main things that I took out from her work was that it, like grievability, like the word grievability, which implies who is grievable or not. Inedibility would imply a conditional tense. So it would imply something which can be hypothetical, or it can be used in situations for the future or scenarios that have not yet taken place. So it's a conditional tense. So a very straight definition I have put forward in the slide, which is whether something would be, because it would be conditional, suitable or good enough for consumption. This is the main conditional tense. And the second thing, while I was doing my research, was the question of inedibility does not really surface as prominently, although it does. but it does in a different way. So it would be something to do with anthropologists would say food taboos, for example, or sometimes it would be biological parameters of which foods are toxic or hazardous. But something when I was reading this famous book by Nick Fiddes on meat, he gives a very succinct kind of definition. It is not definitional as such because it is very abstract, but he says that it's an item's edibility depends, although I've paraphrased it, he says it does not generally depend upon the flavor profile, but whether it finds a position in the socio-cultural context. So classification of acceptable foods. So that is the main idea of what inedible or what we can classify as an inedible. There is always in any culture as such a vast array of items which will be classified as edible or inedible. But for our own purposes, the main idea would be, the main idea I focus on is barnyard animals. And this I have used the instances of barnyard animals, particularly because of the politics that take place on their lives in the Indian context. And secondly, because these animals, when I was doing the studies on them, I realized that the archaeological evidence always portrays these animals as historically edible. So it is very rarely you would find any archaeological or scientific data that says that these animals were considered otherwise. So this I found to be interesting in that way. So this is a definition given by the biologist Carlos Driscoll and his colleagues, where he says they descend from herd living herbivores and they follow a dominant individual. So again, I'll come back to why these things are very vital. And the other thing he says, quotes from Juliet Clutton-Brock, the famous archaeologist, and says that they were food items or walking larders, and they were brought into the human sphere from the transition point from in the Neolithic era from hunting gathering to agriculture. These are the main 2 points he emphasizes, and he gives a lot of data for these things as well. Which is, of course, it is not, the data is not inaccurate as such, but there are a few ambiguities which humanities and social sciences will be better equipped to solve. And one of these ambiguities that I found was in the modification of traits and then in the way domestication is perceived. And the main nowadays, I would say the main model that is being said to be the most accurate or not to be the most to say not accurate, but to do well with something. This would be the pathways to domestication. This is something that Melinda Zeder, the famous archaeologist, she has put forward after her studies. And this allows us not just to differentiate between the various kinds of animals that were domesticated, but the processes as well. So although I would not be giving out a very straight definition of domestication because that always has lots of nuances and debates upon it. Various people have gotten involved in it, and there are fields that have given rise to a lot of contrasting opinions. But one thing which remains common if you had to give out a definition was it's a process of continuous transition. And it comprises both social and biological factors. And a very important point, she says, it is not necessarily intentional. So it is not something that you would think has always been done by humans out of their own will or choice. So this is a very important factor she elaborates. And the other thing she says that it has to do both with intentional and accidental selective pressures. And as Carlos Driscoll also points out, the ambiguity in whenever we talk about domestication of any animal is the ambiguity he states in a very scientific manner, which he says that includes modification of traits, but those affecting mood, uh, behavior such as mood and agnostic and affiliative behavior, as well as social communication. All these things for a scientist is a little bit difficult to classify. And this is where literature or any element of social sciences would be better equipped to understand. In literary studies, especially because affects or moods are something that novelists often try to portray whenever they talk about their character development or any other such things. So these are the few things that have not really been discussed in scientific or archaeological literature, but these are things that somebody from humanities would be more interested in. So how it affects the mood of animals and things of that sort. But before we continue towards this trajectory, uh, the pathways I would like to elaborate very briefly as well. So Zedder gives out three pathways. So there are three, and these can intersect. It is not something which is very strict. So these pathways can intersect. So the three pathways she labels is first the commensal pathway to domestication. So commensal pathways to domestication occurred when when humans dispersed from Africa, they found these wooded regions in the Eurasian or the Crescent Belt. And these wooded regions where not only were good for settling down, but also had lots of animals which were not aware that a carnivore primate would hunt them. So that is why these regions became a good place for humans to gather and then disperse again. Although dispersal has happened in phases, it does not happen in linearity. But what happens during these phases is that there were animals who were attracted to the human niche. And these animals which were attracted found ways to either enter a partnership of domestication. So they found ways to have reciprocal relations. So commensal pathways would be the best represented by cats and dogs. So reciprocal relations and social bonds are more evident in these partnerships. The other pathway she talks about is the prey pathway, where, as I said, the animals were hunted, and like I had said, that it was not intentional, which is well evidenced in archaeological literature, where they say that the main premise of it not being intentional is that overhunting led to the extinction of species, and it was only to stabilize certain populations that humans started to alter their hunting strategies. This is something that Larson and Fuller, Zedder, Driscoll, every prominent archaeologist has specified. In the South Asian context, Ajita Patel and Meadow have also specified how various animals, for example, the onagar in Western India or the black buck, restriction of ranges and extinction of species occurred due to the way overhunting used to happen of these animals. So the prey pathways is what the second pathway was. But again, a very interesting point all these people specify is that within the last 300 to 400 years, there has been a pathway called the directed pathway. The directed pathway where all the knowledge we accumulated throughout the years was used to modify traits that we found to be the most desirable. It was a very unilateral kind of modification now that we take place. And this is something Zedder talks about when she says that domestication is often thought as being mutualistic, but it is a asymmetrical mutualism. It is an asymmetrical mutualism because unlike extended evolutionary processes, say the orchid and the wasp, or symbiotic relations of that sort, these pathways have two major elements, which is the pace and the impact. And these have been also talked about by other famous people like Anna Singh as well in her short treatise on domestication, where she says that it should not be considered as something which benefits both. There is always more to do with harm than benefit, and that I will come to as well as to why I say that. So this is the main thing that these few theoretical elements specify. The few texts that I chose, and I chose these texts, all these are novels by some by Indians, and the main criteria for this selection was they, first of all, they have mass death of a large population of livestock. And secondly, I could also analyze, for example, in the first case, so just to read it out, Perumal Murugan's novel Punachi, or the story of a black goat. Very rarely you would find texts in which the animal is given the prominence rather than a human. And in human animal studies, this is again, it becomes rare to find these kinds of books. And the other thing which was very interesting for me was that in some cases, for example, in Sudha Kaul's Tiger Ladies, you would find evidence of, again, of mass killing as well as eating, so feasting. And then in the Revenge of the Non-Vegetarian, like the name again specifies, you would have killing of animals and sometimes they're feasting. So in the first case, we would have an instance of when an animal will be rendered inedible. In the second case, the effects that mass killing or killing of livestock implies. In the third case, when there is distance involved, when the person is distant from killings, what happens? And in the fourth case, what happens when such a person who's distant from the killings finds himself or encounters the killings that take place for his feast to happen? So I'll give out a few examples from the texts that I have noted down. So, for example, in Sudha Kaul's Tiger Ladies, which is a literary non-fiction. So this is again a non-fiction where she talks about how her families used to make kabarga, which is fried lamb rib. And this becomes interesting because she paints a vivid picture of the thing. So once you paint a vivid picture, you understand how animals are seen by people when they eat animals. So, for example, she says, the feast the old cook has arranged, and it is more or less a predominantly rich family that she comes from, especially in the Indian context. So, a tray of shoulder lamb chops cooked in milk, saffron and herbs, then deep fried in clarified butter, and finally decorated with pure silver leaf that whispers. The trick is to get each piece of lamb to have long ribs, a layer of lean meat, a layer of soft fat, and a paper thin skin of tallow on top, except for the bones. Every bit of the kavarga, which is fried lamb ribs, melt in your mouth. So this is a very luxurious description you get in cases where animals are seen as edible alone. There is no other criteria involved. Then what happens is once you encounter deaths, so for example, in Suketu Mehta's Maximum City, Lost and Found, again, what happens in this scenario is that he encounters large-scale killings taking place during a festival, which is Bakri Eid, which it's a Muslim festival that happens in throughout India. And in one of the poorest parts of the places, he sees large-scale killings that are taking place. So in his case, again, I'll just quote just to see what occurs in his case. In his case, he says that the butchering is so demoralizing for him that he wishes he could stop all the deaths that are taking place in this instance in the festive ritual. So he finds it very gruesome, the killings that are taking place. And in the last case, in the Revenge of the Non-Vegetarian, just to paraphrase, I'm not quoting directly, the protagonist encounters or finds himself in a location where he sees lots of cattle being taken and their bones being broken, they're being put in boiling water, and then they skinned and all these things. And he's an ardent non-vegetarian. So he's one of those people in India who fall into that 3.69 uh, per capita. But that stat is also, if I get the time, I'll just specify how that stat is very misleading. But for our own purposes, in his case, when he witnesses, so witness is something people have talked about as well. When he witnesses these deaths, it creates a transformative effect for him. And he cannot believe that and this is again a quote that I remember, that for a cutlet of meat, this kind of deaths take place. And the main book which describes deaths in a very different manner is the story of a black goat. So although it seems there's a lot of information that I'm giving out, but I'll try to make it even more simple. In the story of a black goat, the main premise is that you have an animal, again a barnyard animal, historically conceived as a food animal, but it displays all the attributes you would associate with, suppose, pet keeping or anything to do with animals that are not rendered as edible. So there is a famous book by, I do not remember the first name of the author, but by Thomas, who says that for anything to be classified as a pet, it has to be, first of all, rendered not edible. So that would be a taboo to eat them. And secondly, it would be named. And thirdly, it would be put in a household, or it would be allowed the freedom to live in a house. These are the three things he suggests. But in the Indian context, what I found out, and also I found this through another sociologist, David Redmom, who talks about it in the Swedish context, in his article on grievability, where he says that sometimes it is not the case that you do not eat the animals you raise, whether they are pet-like or not. And this he calls the circle of life, just to quote him straight. And in our cases as well, in the Indian context, to quote a Sanskrit phrase, they say, Jivo jivasya bhojanam, which means life is the sustenance of life. So, but the question still remains that why should we search, like I said, for inedibility in whatever case? And that is something I'll just dwell on for a couple of minutes. And the main thing I found out, other than saying that domestication is asymmetrical in nature, but the main thing I found out after researching is that the directed pathway that they talk about has more to do with a capitalist imperative as well. And this imperative has had a naturalizing effect throughout this world. So what you would see is this famous geographer points out, Anthony Weiss, in his book, and he talks about the grain oilseed livestock complex. So this is the thing I found very uh, uh, not just interesting, but fascinating as well. That when you talk about grain, oilseed, and livestock, you understand that there is just monocultures of grain and oilseed being grown so that they can be recycled through livestock. And all of these things are being done so that profit can be maximized for the corporate sector. And not just that, he says that this uh, form of agriculture, which started in the temperate region, has been spreading through the tropics, just because there is a assumption that humans are inherently omnivores, and this omnivore assumption leads us to a naturalizing effect wherein they would suggest that it is aspirational as well as natural to eat as much meat as you can. And if you do not do that, then you are lagging behind in terms of progress, which the Western countries are showcasing you as to how progress should be uh, in terms of consumption. And the other important element when he talks about the oil, grain, seed, and livestock complex is that it reduces all the diversity you have in cultural regions, so that monocultures, like I said, of grain, oilseed, and livestock take place. So, for example, in the Indian case, you would find very rarely that you would talk about a cow that is not a Jersey cow. Or if you talk about a cow that is not a Jersey cow, there would be cases that have to do with religion rather than the very fact that some particular varieties of animal are replacing the cultural diversity that was there. And these varieties are more to do with capitalist imperatives again. So Indian Leghorn, for example, in terms of chicken. And similarly, in the cases, although I'm not discussing it in detail, so, for example, black goats in India are becoming very rare because, again, there is a particular variety which the government as well as the market dictates that needs to be recognized in place of the other. So, this was the main element that I found for our own reasons to find or seek inedibility. To seek inedibility again in the conditional way would require us to understand why these changes are taking place, under what circumstances, who is being benefited from it. And just to come back to the point of the naturalizing effect, where people are talked about in terms of being omnivores. So that as well I researched and I found out I did a little bit of human evolution, but although I'm not very well versed in the evolutionary sciences at all, but there were two people, Stanford and Bunn, who pointed out that whether it be true that humans are inherently omnivorous, but the question is, and they talk about this in their book, is that how much was eaten, in what conditions, what was the intake, what was the quantity. All these factors are very ambiguous. So whatever is dictated as the new stat as to how much should be eaten, even in other countries, uh, becomes very it becomes very tenuous. It is not a very straightforward construction. And this as well I found in other ways of reading as well. So, for example, the anthropologist Ian Anderson states that stable foods that were stable could range from termites in Africa, palm sugar in Indonesia, and salmon, for example, 80% of the food for native Northwestern Americans used to be salmon. So this again becomes a very strange construction when we think about the oil, grainseed, and livestock complex. But to come back to literary studies, one main element when we talk about any form of animals and their deaths is when do they become grievable. And this is something I traced from Judith Butler's books, Frames of War, a book on precarity and forms of non-violence. So these are the undoing gender as well as a chapter on it. But these were the three main books that I traced for this particular context. So when would you suggest that a loss is a loss, and when is the politics of the loss as such that would allow you to mourn such lives or to consider these lives worth grieving for? And if there is a life which is not worth grieving for, what happens to such a life? And what are the circumstances that lead to such a life being lived or not lived, livable or unlivable? So, just to give an example from literature again, like the novel of the Black Goat talks about, is that in the Indian context, what we find, also some other works have also looked into it, is that when we talk about animals in the Indian context, we see that these barnyard animals are not really reduced to commodities whenever it takes place in the rural parts of India. As soon as we talk about towns or cities, the changes are more or less replicating what has happened in the Western nations as well. So factory farming, industrialization, meatification of diets are becoming very prevalent here, like the geographer Anthony Wise had said. But in the rural context, we still find narratives where you see that there are kinship bonds with animals. So kinship bonds to do with more than families not being centered on heterocentric or heterosexual norms or anything of that sort, but having a more than human element to it. So in this more than human element, we see that whenever we talk about, say, barnyard animals in these contexts, in rural contexts, we see these lives are more in attune with the way any form of reciprocity in commensal pathways works. So the reciprocity that is said to be presumed in cases of dogs and cats is very well replicated in these cases as well. So there is a term which uh, which they use, which is called mamta. Mamta is a term to do with motherly love. So you have, and although there is a gendered distribution that takes place when we talk about the work you do to raise these animals, but it can also be the case that old men as well share this feature or this attribute, this effect of tending to and finding these animals worthy of losing, of a loss, not in between, suspended between life and death, but worthy of being mourned or being seen as grievable. And these grievable lives allow us to look at these animals in a very different light. And this, again, it becomes a new thing because the pathways that have been bifurcated, you see these pathways collapsing in certain situations. And these pathways collapse only when the effects are traced. So the effects, like I said, of motherly love or effective kinships they talk about, where you see these lives worth not just in terms of just products. So if we go into the government directory of livestock in the Indian context, you would see only these animals being treated as products. So either it is meat, manure, fiber, or milk. But when you get into the rural context, like these stories are also about, you see these various types of affects, whether it is hope, even in cases of sacrifice, they talk about that the sacrifice can only take place in rural India when the animal has been raised by you with love. So love is replaced by blood. But then also the problem that other people have also pointed out is the same problem that I also face when talking about these cases, is that it does not predispose the violence that also happens in these contexts. So whether it be castration or hog tying or any of these other elements that take place in the rural contexts, uh, that also takes place. So there are only this element of grieving animals, which is very different from the industrial complexes we find in cities. Otherwise, if we talk about violence in general, it is not that one case is less violent or the other is more violent. Although ethical ambiguity is there in these cases, but when we consider castration or hog tying, these are more or less equally ethically ambiguous. So this is the main few trajectories I was taking when I was reading and thinking about which lives can become inedible. And the few main things I realized while I was reading and working on my article as well is that it has to do with whether you can mourn them, whether they are considered a loss, whether you can find another pathway for these, and lastly, whether you can see them in terms of the effects they generate rather than the products that they are. So that is the main thing that I wanted to talk about, although there are a few other things as well. For those, I have put down the references just in case somebody wants to go into more detail as well. So these are the main few references I've used for this presentation. But like I said, the few other people that I've named are also very good to read. And there is the last thing I would also say, that whenever we talk about literary studies, the main elements that one should focus on, although there is an interdisciplinary nature involved in animal studies, is to do with the affects one generates, because every other thing that we talk about, whether it be from the archaeological or biological sciences, is very well defined. So the only thing that becomes a little ambiguous in these contexts is whether we can trace those effects. And although this affect theory is a very complicated affair as well, has a lot of trajectories, but for our purposes, more to do with emotions as well and feelings that they generate. So that would be the main elements that I have traced. And that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. So if you would like to ask a question, you can use the hand raise signal, and I'll go ahead and call on you. Or you could go ahead and put a question in the chat, and I can read those aloud. Just remember this is being recorded, so if you don't want your face on camera, use the chat function. I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share. While people are thinking about their questions, I just have a quick follow-up. You said at one point in your talk, if there was time, you would talk a little bit about that statistic of vegetarians being misleading or
Yes, ma'am.
non-vegetarians being misleading. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yes, ma'am. So there is this article by Jacobson and Hansen where they talk about meatification, and what they say is that although the stat is 3.69 per capita in India, which is very low, but there is internal trade as well and international trade as well. So we are the second highest exporter of beef. Uh, that is a very famous stat, and soon we'll be the first. And the second element that is attached to it is that we are one of the biggest dairy producers as well. But what happens is once you produce that amount of milk, and green milk revolution has happened under this government. So once you produce that amount of milk, as soon as the productivity ends, and that is often to do with a cycle of 4 years for cows, which is not their lifespan. So once that cycle ends, they can be smuggled to other places where they can be butchered. So this keeps the flow going. Although some of these things are very political in nature, but what happens is these animals, they somehow find their places to Vietnam, and from Vietnam they are slaughtered, and then it keeps the image of the country intact. And as the lowest consumers of animal protein as such in terms of butchering, but one of the highest consumers of dairy products, and then again, one of the highest exporters of beef. So that is the image that they try to keep intact, very for political and religious reasons. So that is a very fascinating stat. The amount of suffering that takes place is well documented, but the stat obscures this entirely.
Thank you. I think that speaks really well to your point about the role that capitalism has in the construction of inedibility as well. We do have one question in the chat, and then I think I saw Ken raise his hand, so we'll go to Ken next. So the chat has a comment and a question. First, I want to say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I also want to add Dr. Judith Butler's pronouns are they, them, not she, her. And finally, can you please name the scholar who was discussing that to be classified as a pet, the animal needs a name to be able to live in or access the house and is deemed not fit to be killed?
I know the last name is Thomas, and he has done it on annals in England from 1500 to 1800. But if you give me a moment, I can find the exact reference. Would he like the exact, I do not know the pronoun, but would the person like the exact reference? Then
Um,
I can give them the exact reference.
if you want to, I can also email that out when I send out the final
Okay,
recording of this presentation
okay.
to everyone here, so that you don't have to worry about that right now.
Mhm.
Ken, did you have a question or a comment? You are on mute.
Sorry. I just want to commend you for bringing, underscoring this term inevitability. That I can see why we didn't use it. It's hard to say, but I think it's a very important
Mhm.
concept. And I'd like to have you talk about it a little bit more. So your primary thesis is that it seems that uh, ungrievability is a major way that trajectory or pathway toward inevitability. But I know in my own tradition, the Jewish tradition, it was hygiene that identified certain animals that were edible and not edible. Um, and then I heard you say, I think it was the Hindu tradition, that the cow was somehow a symbol of maternal nature or something, and that's why it was selected as inedible. Are there other factors that can be part of that pathway that you could mention? And then a different question, but I'll just put it on the table, is the grievability factor seems to very much implicate human-animal relations. Is the selection of animals or species of animals as grievable related to a relationship that the person has with that animal, as opposed to the more anonymous factory farm kind of situation? If tackle either one. Are there other factors besides the hygiene and the symbolism and the grievability that can lead to an animal being inedible?
Yes, sir. Yeah, this factor I have not really gone into detail, and I have not really researched it well as well, the hygiene factor. Uh, and I did not do that because ideas of, say, pollution or purity are often very intertwined with the factor of hygiene, whether an animal is considered pure enough to be slaughtered or whether it is polluted in cultural contexts. But inedibility, I'm not using it as, uh, I would say, the parameters that biology would dictate. Other than the factor, like the symbolic factor that you talk about, which I might look into, but the factor of hygiene I have not looked into because uh, this is something I found to be it will require me to go into these sciences to extract that kind of information about taboos or why such animals are considered, for example, puffer fish or something like that, is a delicacy, but it is extremely poisonous. So for my own purposes, what I tried to confine myself to is that historically speaking, these are the most edible animals in certain disciplines when we talk about. So when we talk about the prey pathway, the prey animals that are domesticated are these very few varieties of animals. So it is a very broad scope that I take. But I will look into the symbolic factor as well because Douglas's work on purity and danger, I think it's a famous work which talks about some things like that. But I'll look into that, sir. And the second thing, relationship of the person. Yes, that this is something I could not discuss, but this is a very important point. Even in the thing I'm working on, the sometimes it is called effective proximity as well. So what happens is that whether the family has a pet, for example, or the barnyard animal is a pet, for example, in the Indian setting. This is more to do with surveys as well. What you would see is that one person would be greatly attached, and that one person would be suggesting that no matter what the scenario is, but this animal cannot be in any way be rendered edible. But in the same circumstance, as soon as the productivity ends, productivity in the sense of meat, milk, like that, not meat, but milk. In India, it is more to do with milk and manure. Once that productivity ends, members of that family itself would say that now we have to discard that animal. So the relationship of the person matters, is a very significant factor whenever we consider which animal can be eaten or not eaten. And the thing I would like to talk about is that this cultural ambivalence has been researched thoroughly by people. So Arnold Arluke and Clinton Sanders, for example, have talked about the cultural ambivalence. Leslie Irvine, so they have talked in detail that these animals are often any animal, for example, not just these, they are viewed very in culturally very ambivalent ways. So that is something very important, like you pointed out.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I'm going to make a comment on inedibility, and then I'm going to read a question in the chat. After this talk was proposed, I received a message from someone, Minor Clark, who is not here today, but I was going to share something that they passed along. It's in the chat here. They put together a proposal of why inedibility should be added to Wikipedia. So I think that based on your work. So I think that underscores what Ken was saying about the importance of this concept. I'm coming from a discipline from sociology, and for me, what really seems important about this work is the idea that if you can understand the way that edibility or inedibility is socially constructed, you could imagine a way to frame animals as inedible within the context of that culture. But also, what sort of stuck out to me and what in your talk was the importance of capitalism in all this, and that also makes me think that understanding how inedibility is socially constructed, we could also imagine how people can construct currently inedible animals as becoming edible. So I think that your work is touching on just a lot of different disciplines, and this proposal to have this concept added to Wikipedia talks about that. So that's something that I assume that people in this room would be interested in looking at. So I popped that in the chat. We have a question in the chat from Ken. Who says, thank you. Government financial subsidies are a major part of animal agriculture in North America. Can you discuss how government supports the industry in India and if that is a factor in the number of people being able to access eating vegan or vegetarian food products?
Yeah, that is a very good question as well. And particularly because the context differs significantly. For the Indian context, non-vegetarian is an antinomic position. It is a opposite position of vegetarian, and vegetarian is the normative position. It is the standard. So if anybody visits India, vegetarianism is, I would say, it is like meat eating in America. It is something that you do daily. It is not something that happens. Eating animals is, that is why when we talk about animals being eaten in India, you would have old studies. So before the 2000s, they would say it either happens if there are rituals. So for example, Arjuna Padurai study, it would say it happens only when there are rituals or festivals. Even in the novels that I talked about, so there is a festival happening when there is mass slaughter happening as well. So that is one major thing when we talk about vegetarianism. So that is the accessibility for vegetarian food is quite. It is a vegetarian kind of setting, although that has also its nuances because even in this vegetarian setting, you would find studies which suggest that 70% of the population, from 60 to 70% of the population, are non-vegetarian. but the amount of meat they eat is very less. Uh, Coming to the second point the person asked is accessibility. And this is a very good question because accessibility is declining, and it is declining quite steadily in our country. And the main reasons being that, like I said, the few crops that are best suited for recycling into the livestock, whether they like it or not, those are the crops that the government mandates should be the most that are planted. Soya bean, corn, these are the things. Soy, I think it is called. These are the crops. Palm, so palm oil. Every food item in India, if it is, if you find it cheap, and studies have also shown very unhealthy. So great health compromises this country is taking so that they can maximize their profit. So that is something that is happening throughout. So accessibility, I don't think yeah, government supports the industry. Uh, One interesting thing that I wanted to point out is that when we talk about the amount of meat that is being supplied elsewhere, there are only, I would say, although this stat, I do not have the exact stat, but you can count it on a hand, the amount of people who uh, have the monopoly on the distribution. And there are religious factors I would not like to get into because there is a fear of life involved in these cases when you get into really political things. But accessibility in terms of meat is it has to do with very few people operating the abattoirs that are the biggest, the factory farms that are the biggest. I think like Tyson is there in America. The same way in India, there are, although they are not named, because in the Indian context, it is, like I said, it's an antinomic position to be considered a non-vegetarian. Although in some states it is okay, but generally speaking. So that is the main thing. If I'm missing something, I don't think I am, but if I'm missing something, you can ask me. The next question, should I read it out or is there? Oh,
Yeah,
that's a suggestion.
I can read it out, and this is probably the last question we'll be able to take due to time.
Mm.
This is thanks for the talk. My question is to do with the idea of affect you underscore. Literary works make visible what happens inside the animal industrial complex, especially in Western contexts. But what if this suffering is already highly visible? Here I'm thinking of open meat markets and butchers on the streets in Indian cities. I think the hypervisibility here provokes indifference or affective numbness rather than identification or love. Do you have any thoughts how the literary works may be encountered in the global north versus south?
This is a good question as well. Uh, what the person is talking about is true. That in India it is open, unlike the way it is in, say, the West, where it is more or less it is curtailed the viewing. But the same thing I would like to repeat is even in the Indian context, when you, although in it will differ from state to state, but when we talk about barnyard animals, excluding chickens, the butchering is more or less not that visible. And especially when we talk about bigger mammals, so polygastric animals like cows or buffaloes, not monogastric. Even if it is monogastric, uh, it is not really that visible, although it is more visible than the Western countries. And the second thing the person talks about is creating indifference or affective numbness. But again, the issue remains that it will only create that once we realize how the oil, grain, seed, and livestock complex operates. So Jacobson and Hansen's study would be a very good point to start, or even Kritika Srinivasan's study on biopolitics of animal welfare in India. These are very good, just because we are short on time. These are two very good studies to understand how visibility is in the Indian markets as well. So, for example, I have never, although I know there are massive poultry farms in India, massive industrial slaughterhouses, I have never really seen one. To see one, you really have to go in more or less to the outskirts, like it happens in the Western countries as well.
Thank you very much. Well, so with that, we are almost out of time. I'll read one last comment and then we will have to end today's event. The last comment is capitalism originated as an elite white male patriarchal construct that has become globalized. Speciesism is one dimension of the system, even though it predates capitalism. The economic structure remains patriarchal. We need to acknowledge this fact to subvert it. So that was one last comment from our audience. We only have a couple minutes left, so I'd like to give you an opportunity, Dr. Jha, if you have anything you want to say before we end today.
I would just like to thank Carol, and I have, although I'm not really very familiar with Ken Shapiro's work, but I have read a little bit about empathetic awareness, if I'm correct. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was very fascinating when I had read it, but it was a long time ago. I would like to read some more when I have the time. But he's a very, acclaimed person in our discipline. So I was really grateful that I was given this opportunity, and it was very nice to talk to everybody. I hope that because of the time difference, it becomes difficult for me to attend, but I hope if sometime I can attend more of these events. So thank you very much, ma'am, and sir as well, and especially for the way it has been organized as well.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and your ideas with us and for coming to us in the middle of the night so that it would be in
No,
the
that is all
daytime
right,
over
ma'am.
here in the US time zones. I would like to let everyone know we have one more event this academic year, then we pause for the summer. Our next event, I popped it in the chat a little bit earlier, but it will be on May 15th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, the connection between animal abuse and intimate partner violence, current research, and future directions. So hopefully we'll see you all there, and I will send out the recording from this event as soon as it is available. Thank you all and have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.